Thank you, Roger. I'm Geeta Chhabria. I work at IBM at the Global Cloud and Analytics Group. I work with customers around the world in manufacturing and agriculture, and I focus on deriving value from analytics, particularly if you're moving in a cloud IT environment. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to give each of our panelists a couple of seconds to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do.
I'm Robert C. I work for USDA, California Rural Development, and we were just talking, I guess the soundbite way to describe what I do is I'm a policy entrepreneur that works for the government, whatever that means.
My name is Matt Meisner. Is this one? Okay, sorry. I'm Matt Meisner. I lead the data analytics efforts at Farmers Business Network. We're about a 3-year-old company. We're a network of about 15 million acres of farms, and we leverage our network for aggregated network-wide data analysis, and then also for input purchasing and crop marketing for our members.
Hello, my name is...
Hold on. It should be on, dude. What number do you have? I'm sorry.
5.
Switch.
Hello, success. My name is Ryan Schacht. I cover agriculture sales for Planet Labs. Planet Labs designs, builds, and operates the world's largest constellation of Earth imaging satellites. We can image the entire Earth every 2 or 3 days right now. By June or July, we'll have the ability to cover the entire Earth every day. The reason that we do this is to help farmers monitor and measure the health of their crops. So we're building a global authoritative reference layer for farmers to monitor crops.
I'm Dan McCaffrey. I'm the VP of Data and Analytics at Climate Corp. And Climate's focused on digital tools for growers to increase their productivity and sustainability. At the end of the day, it's about ROI, and we're focused on taking all that data from the farm as much as we can and doing machine learning and analytics against it to help the farmers. And at the same time, we're focused on a platform to help accelerate a lot of the innovation that you're seeing today and from other companies, and give them a speedier way to get to the market. And at the same time, that allows us to integrate more of the data sets together to provide even more insights and recommendations to the grower. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about that later.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So we'll get started. We have a couple questions that we have put together so that we can get a discussion going, and then we will welcome some questions from the audience. So we'll start with Robert. Robert, what do you think is the underlying platform that enables new agriculture technology today?
Well, one of the things that most people do not think about is what ties everything you've heard about during this entire day, all these sensors and the different types of technology, they all transmit data. And that data transmission has to have broadband access off the farm field. So that's really the underlying technology, and I would argue that broadband today, especially in rural areas, we're in the 21st century equivalent to the way we were in the 1930s with electricity, where electricity had come to the big cities, not come to rural areas, and then there was a public policy challenge to bring it out there, and it was transformative to rural life and the rural economy. Same thing today with rural broadband. The distinction is that broadband in the farm field needs to be wireless, because when you think about broadband, there's two ways it comes to you. It's either through fiber to the house or wireless or Wi-Fi, and if you want to think about it in those terms. But none of these sensors, you're not going to run wires across the farm. So I would say that's the underlying piece. And then the secondary underlying piece, or you've already heard about this, tying all of these sensors together is really the data analytics in the cloud, which is why the broadband is important. And so I want to use this opportunity to try to define a new word, and I want to see where it goes in terms of data analytics as applied to agriculture. And I'll call it, I have it up there, it's data agrilytics instead of analytics, as the subset of data analytics focused on agriculture. And I'll even define it, that it is the combination of what you would call data analytics plus agronomics, which would be agricultural economics combined, plus agricultural science. So it's a specialized field. So I want to see if this catches, as in terms of that's what's in common with all the ag devices. They all need data. Now I've stopped myself on that. Data agrilytics doesn't come that smoothly off the mouth yet. But if we get to that point, say next year, it would be great to see.
We should put a hashtag around that. And so one follow-up question for you, Robert, is what do you think is the new area of opportunity here in agriculture technology?
I think there's three areas that are there. One, which really hasn't been addressed too much, but it's food safety. And this is an area that's driven by government regulation, because a few years ago, the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed and is now being put into place by the FDA. And if I were to turn what that actual regulation is into a soundbite, basically it means trace back to the farm. So what that means is there is an opportunity and actually a need in order for farmers to meet that regulation and to meet it economically, because that's also an issue. What you're going to need are sensors that can do rapid diagnostics for whatever pathogen you're looking for in the field. And they do exist. I've seen them, and they're just beginning to be commercialized. I think that it's an underexploited opportunity that's there. The second one is agrobotics, or robots. There was discussion earlier on automation and robotics in the field. I think that's really rapidly going to come. There's the newer sensor technology that makes it work better. That's an opportunity. And then wearables. And there's wearables both for animals, which there actually was a discussion earlier about that, but there's wearables for farm workers, health wearables for farm workers on the farm field. Same kind of need for the wireless broadband connection. That's a wide open field.
Thank you so much. Matt, if I could ask you to share your thoughts around data analytics and the value it can provide to farmers, but why do you think farmers are often skeptical of this new technology?
Yeah, I think the skepticism often comes from a few reasons. I think the underlying reason is just that a lot of the decisions that various technologies are trying to help with are really risky and important for farmers. So something that recommends what seed a farmer plants or how much fertilizer or water they apply, these are decisions that can turn them, especially in a commodity market like this, turn them from profitable to unprofitable in one decision. So they're inherently going to be averse to changing something that has always worked well unless you can really provide a lot of compelling evidence that what you're suggesting or your technology will work. And I think where, as people focused on technology, we sometimes miss the boat is we start with technology and then try to find a way that farmers should use it rather than starting with, going to farmers and actually figuring out what their problems are and what their pain points are, and then developing the simplest possible technology that'll solve that, or at least help with it, rather than coming at it from this is a cool technology, this works really well, but what is the actual ROI, and what's the use case on the farm? So I think that's one piece of it, and I think another piece of it is that we often are, we have to be careful just how we position things. We need to be cognizant of the social, effect of coming in and saying, hey, we know better than what you've done for a long time. I think you have to maintain a lot of humility and, be honest about how well you can do at the beginning rather than, over-promising and setting unrealistic expectations. So I think it's a mixture of factors, but those are a few things in my experience that I would point to.
Great. Yep. Can you share a little bit more about what value do you think data analytics can bring to the farmer? Just specific examples.
Yeah, sure. So, at FBN, we work with all sorts of data from planting monitors, chemical and fertilizer applications, yield data. We then integrate weather data, soil, topography, everything. We basically try to get everything that we can get our hands on that might be relevant for farming. And there's a lot of use cases where that can provide a lot of value. One that we focus on a lot is selecting seeds, which for farmers growing corn, soybeans, wheat, crops like that in the Midwest, this is one of their biggest decisions every year. And it's one that's really important to get right. It has a big impact on their yield, big impact on their production costs, big impact on their risk profile. And historically, it's been a decision that's been hard to make with a lot of data because farmers have, limited experience with only a few varieties that they've planted on their farm. And otherwise, they were left looking at trial data for how a variety might have performed in a research plot, which is better than no data, but is not as good as real world data. So this is a case where, very, very simple analytics. We don't have to have any fancy models or fancy machine learning or anything, but just aggregating data on how these varieties have performed before for other farmers in the same area can really make this decision significantly more data-driven than it ever was before. And there's various ways to make it more sophisticated in the future, but even a really, really simple approach of just aggregating the data and showing how these varieties have performed before has led our members to have much more data at their hands when they're making one of these really critical decisions.
Great. Thanks so much. So Ryan, you told us a little bit about Planet. Can you just tell us about how Planet serves farmers and what are some challenges in delivering successful outcomes to growers in the indirect market?
Yes, I think we're a little bit unique on this panel in terms of we don't actually sell directly to growers. Planet happened to be one of those companies that we actually did start with a cool technology and a hypothesis. That hypothesis was that there's a fundamental data scarcity issue faced by the industry at large. There just wasn't enough credible remote sensed satellite imagery available for farmers to make decisions. So for us, it was about finding the right partners that could take our data and make it meaningful and actionable to data. As it turns out, your everyday farmer doesn't really know what to do with pixels. They need an intermediary there to help figure out why those pixels matter to their farming operations. So my experience was going out into the market and finding companies like Climate Corp, as Dan mentioned, to help kind of take our solution to market. So companies that we've found success with are those that, number one, have a strong appetite for innovation. Number two, have the creativity and the appetite for risk. We have a very large data set. We produce about 7 terabytes of data every single day. So it's not for the faint of heart to try to tackle that problem in terms of making that data set relevant to farmers. I guess the other thing that's obviously required is a robust analytical tool set to munge through that data, to look for relationships, and to make the data actionable.
Yeah, and Dan, if I could ask you to comment a little bit about that. Ryan mentioned 7 terabytes of data a day. That's not for the faint of heart. And more we're seeing this influx of data that no one knows what to do with. Everybody thinks that just getting the data is the challenge, but really making sense of the data and finding actionable insight out of it is the challenge, right? So how does Climate help farmers manage that influx of data and then turn that data into actual insight?
So it's a common problem with analytical platforms, and something we all, just stepping back for a second, there's this explosion of data, and the biggest problem right now for all these analytical companies is help us make sense of it. Don't just share the descriptive data, but help us with what's called prescriptive and recommendations. So, how does climate help? So climate's a little further along, and we're a part of Monsanto, and that's actually helped us to, well, and maybe stepping back once more. You're seeing tons of innovation in the ag industry, particularly for individual problems, whether it's irrigation or whether it's within the tractor. There's significant innovation that you're seeing. Where I think we're still kind of behind, and it's similar to healthcare in a lot of ways, is the aggregation of all these different data sets. And this is where you hear the buzzwords about machine learning and more advanced deep learning and things like that. They actually really do work, but the problem is the breadth and depth of the data. So companies that are able to get all these different data sets together can actually do something meaningful for the farmers, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But the hard part, particularly with row crops, is it's an old business and it's very relationship driven. So what's helped when climate was absorbed by Monsanto already has a lot of these relationships across all the growers. That's allowed us to really build out and get tens of millions of acres, each acre with different data layers of planted, harvested, sprayed. We have soil and weather and all kinds of different data that we can bring together. The data is the hardest part. It's less about infrastructure now and data science talent even, because that's almost commoditized. Some people won't believe me on that, but it's all, the tools for doing these things at scale are becoming more and more commoditized. Right now, it's really all about the data. That is the hardest part. So climate, we've been fortunate enough to be able to grow pretty significantly and we're just at the cusp of going from these old process-based models from research on individual farms that were at Climate or at Monsanto and building like nitrogen prediction or even seed selection and prediction. Now we're marrying that with a lot of the customer data that we've have in-house, and that's allowed us, through machine learning, allowed us to be a lot more predictive and allow the farmers. You just heard about the Gallo example in the last talk. Perfect example. I'd say the biggest opportunity is about treating the farm in a subzone way. Instead of treating your farm as one, just bringing more and more data to treat it in a subzone way, and whether it's nitrogen or how your irrigation or the seed selection. And we're beginning to roll out those features at Climate. We've been very heavily focused on the data ingestion and getting lots of data to make that machine learning work. And now we're at that cusp of really turning that around and delivering the next level, or what I'd call the holy grail, which is the prescriptive and the recommendations for the grower. So they don't have to infer everything necessarily, though they tend to know better than the rest of us. We can give them more data and make recommendations, and they can pick which ones might make the most sense for them.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come back to Robert, and this question is for each of you, so we'll go around the panel. But can you share some best practices on that might help drive adoption of new technology in agriculture? What are your thoughts around what technology needs to get adopted today in order to make the impacts and drive the use cases that we're talking about for the future?
Well, since we're in California, the focus, even though the drought theoretically has ended, but the focus of California agriculture is always going to be on water, and it's managing the water they use. So I think the drought for the last 5 years, what that did was it broke the status quo in the existing delivery of water and access to water, and it forced a change much faster and adoption of the most efficient means of irrigating the plants. And it's not just a minimum amount of water, but it's actually also the agri-science part is managing the plants so that in some cases you can reduce the amount of water and increase yields. And that's the ag science part. The adoption of that, I think, comes through, we're seeing a little bit of a generational shift in farming, that and it's usually dad or grandfather who will say, like, what is all this what's this data stuff? We'll question that. I farmed this way for 50 years, and your grandfather farmed this way for 50 years. You have that kind of thing, and it worked for us, and we got through the droughts of the 30s. But the kid, on the other hand, we hope has gone to one of the ag schools in California and come back with the latest knowledge, which is the data science, the latest things there, and wants to apply it. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, the kid, I just call it the kid, will come in and be able to do that. And we're seeing that shift. So if you can sort of reach the kid, I would say is the best opportunity.
Right. Great. Matt?
Yeah, I think the hardest part is just convincing people that they should even be thinking about data at all. Because in California, to some extent, with higher value crops, people have been collecting data and thinking about data a lot already. But if you go to a wheat farmer in South Dakota or something like that, where your yields are dependent on rain and factors outside of your control under many cases, it's just not a clear ROI to many farmers why they should even be thinking about data. And they're really busy, right? They don't have time to be spending hours and hours and hours poring over research and analytics and stuff to try to make the best decision. They're often, working 80 hours a week to try to make ends meet. So I think what we have to do is we have to be very clear about showing, the ROI of new data analytics, so that it's not that's an add-on to the way I used to do things, but it really becomes that's very clear to me if I spend, 4 hours a week or whatever looking at this data, what I'm going to get in return, rather than, trying to tack it on to their existing workflows, in which case it can be hard to make the case that it's essential, because it's not something that's historically been done, at least ubiquitously.
Right. Thanks so much. Ryan, what are your thoughts?
So I guess our biggest hurdle for adoption is proving value to the end user, to the grower, and that's not a question that we're really set up to answer very well without our partners. And looking at it from that standpoint, partners that are generally most successful at helping us answer that question are those that have the infrastructure that these guys have in terms of the platform, the data platforms to do the analysis, but also to be able to make that connection from the data analysis to what's going on in the field. So folks that have robust field trial operations and are able to use our data in an R&D capacity to explore relationships, to test and validate hypotheses, and then to think more about how does that scale from an R&D level to a commercial production scale. So starting to make the connections between what's going on with the grower data and looking at the relationship between R&D and what's actually going on at a production scale in the farm. So I'd say that it's having that infrastructure of having the data analytics, but also the R&D on the farm, and then the connection to real-world grower data.
Great. Dan, what are your thoughts?
So there's a common theme there, and I forgot to touch on it before, but ease of use, is a huge one, right? So, the easier we can make it for these farms to automatically be ingesting the data and streaming it back, and through iPad devices and having wireless and sensors are another huge part around making these models more accurate, infinitely more accurate. But that ease of use theme is pretty critical, and I touched on the recommendations part. That's a part of it. So the grower doesn't right now today, and even within the climate tool that we have today, there's a lot of inferring that the grower has to do for some of it. But more and more you see us, now that we've grown enough data, we're getting more and more into that space, including the predictive, and you'll see us advance all, across the industry more and more. At the same time, because we do, we're part of a pretty large company, and so we've got a pretty large collection of physical and biological and data and computer scientists, and the infrastructure and that allows us to do this kind of machine learning at scale. One of the things that we've recognized more recently in the last year is we can probably help the whole industry accelerate by offering spurring that up. Because we're not going to go innovate in every particular niche. It's just not going to happen. But we do see, and that's helpful for us, but it's also helpful for the industry at large. And you'll start to hear more and more about these partnerships that we're doing, including some of your peers at the USDA, that we're just, these ideas that are being around, allowing farmers to, whether it's for, reporting their crop yields to insurance, or whether it's reporting, how well they're managing their farms and the farming practices that they're doing today. If we can provide a platform to allow a lot of these other companies to innovate quickly and worry less about infrastructure or acquisition is a huge one, right? Getting to the farmers and these growers in general, or even dealers in general, it's hard. And so if we can open that up, it might spur a lot of the innovation. So we're pretty focused on that as well. And I think industry-wide, that's a common theme.
Great, excellent feedback. I want to open it up for some questions before we run out of time. So if you have a question, I see a gentleman with a hand up right there. I don't know if we can get a mic to him.
The comment about bandwidth, why couldn't you use some low bandwidth solutions like Sigfox, or there's a number of companies that, for the industrial IoT space, that are coming out with broad coverage, low bandwidth, right? You can go long distance, but the bandwidth is going to be low. Why is the assumption that you need this high bandwidth capability when you're transmitting very tiny bits of data, and storing them?
Actually, I think the way you have to look at it is this, that a lot of the existing sensors do not transmit a lot of, they are low bandwidth, they don't transmit a lot of data, but I think it's important not to be misled into thinking that means you just need a low capacity wireless broadband system. Because if you talk to some of the people that are in the delivery of these sensors, the reason why they don't use a lot of bandwidth is because that is the current constraint, that there isn't a lot available, and they're trying to maximize what they do. In the future, this is very much like when the internet came out. No one really knew what we were going to do with it. And then all of a sudden, all these uses explode across it and drive up the bandwidth needs. Same thing, I think, is going to happen with agriculture. So I would put it, the analogy this way is, we don't want to build a narrow gauge railroad as the standard for broadband connection in the farm field when we're going to need a standard gauge to carry the load. What I can answer is, I cannot tell you what that standard gauge is supposed to be because we're still evolving in that direction.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I maybe add to that just a little bit? Some of the there's problems in the U.S. too, and we're in Brazil now, and this is a huge problem. Just no connectivity. But there's interim things I think that we can do. And right now we're experimenting with a lot of the devices, but we plan to seed a lot if it's improving all the models in the way we expect. So we're creating these hubs. So one of the models is, you have the iPad, which can go around and collect all the data, and when it gets back to a higher bandwidth place, it can send it all back to the hub. In most cases, the data doesn't necessarily need to be real time unless you're in the tractor, in the cab, or some other place. It really needs to be real time there. But that's one of these interim solutions where you have wireless, across the farm, like you said, at different bandwidths for different needs. But then you can have these, and oftentimes the iPads are so powerful now. They have so much space. And this is how we're solving it in Brazil, by the way, too. Is these hubs that can collect all the data, and then when they get back to a high connection point, it'll send it all back up.
Thanks. Is there any other questions that the panel can take for you? Well, thank you so much to each and every one of you. Thanks for the insightful feedback. And if anybody wants to take a conversation with these panelists, they'll be here for the rest of the day. Thank you again.